Chapter 6. As it grew colder, Ernie's job became more difficult. Within a month of marrying, she had 5 guests, not counting her new husband, and each man brought more work with him. She did laundry as an extra service, for more money, but she found she was spending a full day washing clothes and hanging them on the line. She designated every Wednesday as wash day unless it rained, and then she adjusted to another day of the week. Sometimes she paid Katie to help her, and afterward they'd have tea and cookies and play with the baby together. The cold hard truth was that Ernie was exhausted. When Cliff came home for lunch on a Friday in late October, he frowned at her. "You're pale. You're doing too much." He told her to sit down while he served everyone lunch. "I can't sit. This is my job. You work hard all day." His business was already becoming wildly popular. He and Jake had made one free saddle for one of the area ranchers, and the rancher had bragged about it to all of his men and his friends. Before long, there was a waiting list for saddles. She pushed him gently toward a chair, knowing the other 5 men would be along soon. She hadn't expected so many to take her up on her offer to cook lunch, but they all loved her cooking. For lunch that day she served a hearty chicken stew. There was already snow on the ground, and the men needed a good, hot meal to get them through their days. They all trickled in, taking their seats at the table. The men had learned early on that they were expected to wait until everyone was seated and the prayer had been said before they started reaching for food. After everyone was served, Ernie took her seat at the foot of the table closest to the stove. She could serve the men their seconds when they asked. Cliff said a quick prayer, and the men passed the biscuits around. "What are your plans for this afternoon?" he asked Ernie. "I need to make up the beds and get supper on." The men paid an extra 5 cents a week for her to straighten their rooms and make their beds for them, but they all thought it was a good deal. Which meant she was making 6 beds every day, as well as cooking 3 meals a day for 7 people. The parlor could use a good dusting as well. One of their new boarders, Jerome, played the piano. He and Jake played for them every night, and Ernie enjoyed listening to the music. It was strange being the only woman amongst 7 men, but she enjoyed her work, and she was used to always having a house full of people. If not for the constant fatigue she was feeling, she was certain she'd be in her element. When the men were gone after lunch, Cliff lingered. "I'm getting worried about you, Ernie. You're doing too much, and there are shadows under your eyes." Ernie sighed. "I guess I could start paying Katie to come over and help every day. She could bring the baby." Cliff smiled. "I like that idea. I know you won't make as much, but my business is doing well enough that we really won't need your income much longer." She nodded. "I'll talk to her this afternoon." He leaned down and kissed her before heading for the door. "Take care of my wife. She's awful special to me. Take care of my husband." Ernie watched him leave, her eyes on his shoulders. He had to be the strongest, most wonderful man alive. Never had she dreamed a man would treat her as well as Cliff treated her. He made her feel as if she was someone truly special to him, even though she knew he didn't love her. He'd only married her to keep her name from being dragged through the mud, but she loved him for it. As soon as she finished the lunch dishes, she walked next door. Katie came to the door, the baby against her shoulder. "Hi, Ernie. Come in." Ernie smiled, stepping inside the other woman's house. When she'd first married, she'd come over for tea a couple of times, but she'd gotten too busy for those little afternoon visits. "Thank you. I was just about to have some tea and cookies. Would you like some?" "I would love some. You remind me of my sister, Elizabeth. Anytime anyone goes to her house, expected or not, she sits them down and feeds them tea and cookies. It doesn't matter who they are or what they're doing there. Tea and cookies for everyone." Katie grinned, leading the way into the kitchen. "You sit while I put the baby down. It's time for her nap anyway." Instead of sitting, Ernie went to the stove and put the tea kettle on. She couldn't just sit around and let the other woman do all the work. When Katie came back to the kitchen, she found that the kettle was on, and there was a plate of cookies nicely arranged in the middle of her table. Ernie had even done the few lunch dishes that she'd planned to wash as soon as the baby was down for her nap. "You were supposed to sit and wait for me." Ernie shrugged. "Idle hands, and all that." "Your hands are never idle." "I'll get the tea." "You sit." Ernie took a seat at the table, watching her friend pour the tea into 2 cups. She wasn't sure how to bring up the help she needed. "I want to thank you for helping me with the laundry on Wednesdays. It's been a huge help to me." Katie smiled as she set the 2 cups on the table and sat down. "I'm happy to help any time. And I like having a little money of my own. Ethan is so tight-fisted. I love him, but he doesn't think I should spend any extra money at all. I'm not allowed to make Abigail any new dresses until she outgrows the ones she's got. I like to make her new things." Ernie grinned. "I have a proposition for you then, my friend." Katie tilted her head to one side, a slow smile spreading across her face. "You want me to help more?" "I do. I was hoping you could help at least 3 days per week, but preferably 5 days a week. I'd pay you, and you could bring the baby." "Yes. I'd love to. Ethan won't care as long as I get my own chores done. I could work for you from 10 till 3. That would give me enough time to do my chores and cook supper. I could even just do our laundry when you do it there." "Really? You wouldn't mind?" "Work is more fun when you do it with a friend. I think it will be wonderful. It won't feel like work, and we'll get to talk." Ernie breathed a sigh of relief. "I was afraid I was going to have to send for one of my sisters to help me out. It's just too much work for me right now. I don't know why, but I'm always tired. I thought I was going to faint earlier. Do I strike you as a woman who faints?" Katie looked at her oddly for a moment. "Are you carrying?" Ernie blinked a couple of times. Why hadn't that occurred to her? "I don't think so. I've only been married a month." "That doesn't mean anything. When was your last cycle?" Ernie thought back. "It was over just as I left home." "And that was?" "6 weeks ago, I guess, but I've never really been regular." Ernie shook her head. "I can't be expecting already. I have a boarding house to run." Her mother had always spent the first 3 months of her pregnancies vomiting profusely. She couldn't imagine trying to work if that happened. "Well, see if it comes, but you might be so tired because you're expecting." "I want babies, but I want some time to be a bride first." Ernie enjoyed her time with Cliff after they turned off the lights, and she wasn't ready to have a huge belly yet. She wanted him to love her before that happened. Tears sprang into her eyes, and she dashed them away angrily. "Now you've gone and made me all weepy." Women get weepy when they're carrying. I think I cried at least 6 times a day for the entire time I was pregnant. I demanded that Ethan go back to New York and get my mother, too. I think he thought I'd lost my mind." Ernie giggled. "Well, I doubt if I'll demand Cliff go get my mother. I can't imagine her being of much help." She took a sip of her tea. "I'm not going to worry about it just yet. If I haven't started in a couple of weeks, then I'll see the doctor." Her eyes widened. "I haven't met the doctor yet." "There is a doctor in town, isn't there?" Katie shook her head. "No, but there's an experienced midwife. Her name is Jessica Sims. Would you like me to introduce you at church on Sunday?" Ernie nodded. That might be for the best. She took the last bite of her cookie and stood. "I'm glad you'll be helping me soon." "Starting Monday?" "Absolutely. I can't wait to buy more fabric to make pretty dresses for Abigail." "Well, I'm going to go and make up 6 beds and do some dusting," And make supper. I'm tired just thinking about it. You're carrying. Katie said the words definitively, as if there was no doubt in her mind. I hope not. As she said the words, Ernie realized they weren't true. You know what, I hope I am. I'm ready to have a baby. Katie smiled. I'll pray that it's true, then. I'm sure of it, but you have to be as well. Ernie walked home slowly, as if in a daze. What was she going to do if she was already pregnant? Would she be able to keep running the boarding house? Would Cliff even want her to? He would be worried about her every minute. The man may not love her yet, but he was the definition of a doting husband. He hovered over her every minute, making sure she wasn't tiring herself out too quickly, and that was without knowing she was expecting. When she got home, she started some chicken stewing. Chicken and dumplings sounded wonderful to her, and she was going to worry about what she was hungry for, not the men. They'd deal with anything she cooked as long as there was cake for dessert. Cake sounded awfully good, too. Once that was done, she headed up the stairs to make the beds in the 5 bedrooms up there. She picked up the clothes the men had thrown on the floor and put them into the basket that was in each room. She preferred that each man kept his own clothes in his room so she could keep track of which clothes belonged to which man. Each room was dusted and cleaned, and she was making fresh bread when Cliff got home that afternoon. She thought briefly about telling him what she and Katie suspected, but she decided to wait. She didn't want Cliff to ask her to stop working immediately. Katie's going to work for me every day from 10 to 3 starting Monday, she told him. I'm excited, and she's excited to have the income she can do whatever she wants with. You'd think Ethan would make enough that she didn't need to work, but I'm glad she's going to work for you. Oh, I think he makes plenty, but he doesn't let her spend it on things he considers frivolous. She wants to make the baby a pretty dress, and he thinks the baby has enough clothes until she outgrows the ones she has. Cliff nodded, a smile touching his lips. I understand then. She wants to be able to do whatever she wants with money, and he won't allow it. Yes. As long as she's earning her own money, he won't mind as much. She put 4 loaves of bread in the oven before turning to him. Are you going to be so tight-fisted after the children arrive? He shrugged. I have no idea. It depends on our financial situation at the time. Right now I'd have to be. We're making good money, but I need some more tools, and we need to keep putting so much into the business. If you give me 6 months, I think it would be just fine for you to buy what you need. So you don't want me to have a baby before 6 months? She asked, her eyes wide. What would he say when he found out she was already expecting? He laughed. Well, if you could wait, that would help me out a lot. Chapter 7. At church on Sunday, Ernie noticed that the same woman who had whispered with Mrs. Abbott about her at the store was again whispering behind her hand as she pointed at Ernie. She groaned mentally as she walked over to Katie to talk to her. You were going to introduce me to the midwife in town. Oh, yes. Jessica. I'm not going to tell her what we think, but just introduce you because you're the new woman in town. Would that work? Ernie nodded. That would be perfect. I don't want Cliff to know my suspicions just yet. Katie frowned at her. Why not? I'll explain later. Katie just shook her head, leading her over to an older woman, who was standing off to one side of the room looking angry. Mrs. Sims, this is my friend, Ernie Solomon. She's new in town, and she runs the boarding house. Mrs. Sims looked Ernie up and down. Nice to meet you. You'll be needing my services soon, won't you? Ernie shrugged. Not that I know of. I'm just trying to meet everyone in town. I see. Mrs. Sims looked skeptical, but she didn't press the point. You married? Yes, I was married a little over a month ago. Don't work too hard. You look delicate. Ernie laughed. I'm anything but delicate, but thank you very much. She wandered away with Katie at her side. Why does she look angry? Mrs. Sims always looks angry. One of these days, we'll both figure out why. The baby in Katie's arms fussed a bit. She's been fussy all weekend. I think she's cutting teeth. My mother always said to rub whiskey on them. She doesn't drink, and neither does my father, but they always kept whiskey around for the little one's gums. Katie's eyes widened. I don't know if I could put whiskey on her gums. She's a baby. I think my mother always thought it would help us sleep as well. She was never one who was too worried about most things. But she was almost always pregnant with next one. I'll think on it. Katie didn't look like she was willing to do anything that involved her baby and alcohol, and Ernie couldn't blame her. Now that she thought about it, she didn't necessarily want an infant developing a taste for spirits. Ernie noticed that the woman who had been talking about her was with someone else, still whispering behind her hand. Who is that woman? Ernie asked, nodding in the direction of the gossiper. Katie frowned. That's Mrs. Jenkins. She's the biggest gossip in town. If she can't find something bad to say about someone, she'll make something up. That's awful. I know. I stay away from her as best I can. She's not been fond of me since the day I told her I refused to listen to any of her lies. Ernie covered her mouth with a laugh. You didn't. I did. And I won't. She doesn't speak to me now, but there's no doubt in my mind she speaks of me. Ernie shook her head. I know her type. There were some older women who were like that back home. They weren't content unless they were saying something mean about others. Cliff caught her eye from across the room where he was talking to the pastor. He motioned for her to join him, and with a mumbled, "Excuse me," she hurried across the church, wondering what she'd done. When she reached Cliff, he looked more serious than she'd ever seen him. There are rumors about you again. Ernie closed her eyes, sighing. Do I even want to know what's being said? Cliff shook his head. No, you don't, but the pastor has been informed of your wrongdoing. He needs you to confirm or deny it. Ernie glanced over and saw Mrs. Jenkins staring at her, a smirk on her face. She couldn't imagine why the woman disliked her, but she turned to the pastor. What's been said? There was no doubt in her mind about who had said it. You've been accused of being free with your favors, with all the men staying in the boarding house. The pastor seemed embarrassed to even say it. Ernie's eyes widened. I'm a married woman. That's part of the problem the ladies in town have with you. You're a married woman, and they think you're being promiscuous. Mrs. Abbott claimed that you threatened to entertain her husband. Ernie flushed. Well, I did do that. I was angry with her for saying I shouldn't be entertaining unmarried men, and I asked if she wanted me to entertain married men, starting with her husband. I shouldn't have said it, because I didn't mean it, but I was so furious with her accusations that the words just slipped out. I can understand that, the pastor said. And the rest of it? It's not true, is it? I hate to even ask, but you've been accused, and you have the right to deny it. Ernie crossed her arms over her chest. What would happen if I were doing it? I'm not, of course, but if I was, what would you do about it? There's nothing I could do. They think I have a lot more power than I do. The pastor shrugged. I'd pray for you to see the error of your ways, but that would be about it. Ernie laughed. Well, I'm glad there's not an error to my ways then, aren't you? The pastor patted her shoulder. Very glad. I'm sorry I had to talk to you about it at all. Anyone can see how you and Cliff feel about each other. Ernie didn't look at her husband at those words. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to defend myself, she said softly. Now I'm going to go home and make lunch for 6 hungry men. I've heard rumors that you make the best meals in all of Prairie Dog, the pastor said with a smile. Pastor, are you wanting me to make lunch for 7 hungry men? I would be forever grateful if you did. Ernie smiled at the older man. Lunch will be ready in an hour. We'd love to have you. Thank you for the invitation. I thought I'd never get one. Ernie's eyes met Cliff's, and she realized then that he still looked angry. Surely, he didn't believe what had been said. I'll see you at home, she said softly, worried now. I'll walk with you. He offered her his arm, and they left the church looking like a happily married couple. As soon as they were out of the church, she dropped his arm. You don't believe the gossip, do you? Cliff felt a new wave of anger wash over him. He'd defended her to the pastor, only to have her think he believed it? Do you really think so little of me? Ernie immediately realized her error. Of course not, but you looked angry. I wasn't sure why. I'm angry because there are women in this town who feel the need to spread lies about my wife. He couldn't believe that she'd thought so poorly of him. I'm sorry. I couldn't imagine that you were angry for me and not with me. She sighed. You have to remember that I'm used to everyone getting angry with me from time to time. They reached the house, and she opened the door to go in. And by assuming you were angry with me, I've made you angry with me. I think I'll just go fix lunch, and we'll go from there. She hurried inside, and he stared after her. He needed to do something physical to get rid of this anger before he saw her again. He wished he hadn't already built the fence for Roscoe, but he had. Instead, he went into the house and changed into old clothes. Ernie quickly warmed up the lunch she'd had waiting in the icebox. She'd made chicken pies, and she suspected the pastor would like them as well as the other men did. She heard the front door close again, and she knew that Cliff was off to do something. She had no idea what, but she was glad he wasn't going to stay there being angry with her. The men began trickling in right around noon, taking their places at the table. The pastor was among them, and he rubbed his hands greedily as he looked at the food she'd prepared. Cliff was the last to arrive, and he took his spot at the head of the table, still looking more than a little put out. The pastor prayed, and then the table was as boisterous as usual, everyone serving themselves slices of the chicken pie and exclaiming over how wonderful it was. Through it all, Ernie watched Cliff, sensing that he was still angry with her, but she didn't know what to do about it. After the meal, the pastor watched her as she cleared the table. You're looking awfully tired, lass. Are you all right? Ernie nodded. It's just a lot of work to have so many guests. She carried the dishes to the sink she'd already filled with hot soapy water. The pastor frowned at her. I'm a bit concerned about you. Don't let the other women in town get you down. The last pastor who was here had a wife who led the gossipers, and now the women think it's all right to gossip whenever they choose. I don't allow it, but there's a lot of animosity toward me because of it. I'm sorry, Pastor. And she was, but she had no solutions for him. This is only the second church I belong to, but the other was just as bad with gossip. The older women called my brothers and sisters and me a terrible name. Really? He asked, his eyes wide. What did they call you? The demon horde. Ernie made sure her back was to him as she said the name, a smile crossing her lips. She knew he would be disgusted by the name, but they deserved it. They didn't. Oh, they did. I've had that name applied to me for most of my life. She washed the dishes quickly, stacking them so she could wipe them dry. To her surprise, the pastor picked up the towel she had laying on the counter and dried them. Did you deserve to be called that? He asked. She grinned at him. Oh, we deserved so much worse than that, Pastor. He laughed. Somehow I had a feeling you'd admit it if you did deserve it. You're a special young lady, Ernie Solomon. Thank you. I don't deserve what the ladies here are saying, though. I work hard cooking and cleaning. I don't have time to do what I'm accused of. I'm just too tired. Why, she was often too tired to see to her own husband's needs, let alone those of 5 other men. She couldn't imagine a woman who could do that. I knew when they said it they were lying. You're too sweet to do anything like they accused you of. He looked behind him, as if to see who else was in the room. Are you having trouble with your marriage? Cliff seems to be very angry. He was angry that the women accused me like they did, and then he became angry with me because I asked if he believed them. She sighed. I should have known he would never believe foul lies like that. Yes, you should have. Your husband is a proud man, and he's not going to take a slight like that very well. He made a stack of the dishes he dried so she could put them away later. Do you want me to talk to him? Ernie considered it for a moment before shaking her head. No, I think I'll talk to him myself. I don't want him to think that I ran to you as soon as we had a little trouble. All right. I'll leave it alone then. He looked around. You don't have any pets, do you? She shook her head. No, just Roscoe. The pastor laughed. How'd you end up with that ridiculous old goat? Cliff bought him for me so he could keep my grass trimmed. You know Roscoe? Oh, everyone in town knows Roscoe. He's the orneriest goat in all of Montana. She looked at him with surprise. Roscoe isn't ornery. He's just mischievous. He really enjoys wearing my bonnet. I've tried to take it off him time and time again, but he runs from me when he realizes what I'm doing. I got it from him once, but the next time I put one on the line, he was wearing it again. I've decided to just let him wear a bonnet if he likes them so much. The pastor grinned. Well, since you're so good with animals, how would you like a kitten? She grinned at him. I love cats. Where'd you get a kitten? I got a cat for the church 2 years ago when I first got to town, and she had a litter of kittens. They're 6 weeks old now, so they're ready to find new homes. Would you like one? I would. I can't be sure, but I thought I heard a mouse the other day, and I can't be having rodents if I'm going to run a boarding house. Or if she was carrying. She had heard stories of mice climbing into cradles with babies, and she wasn't having that with her baby. I'll bring it by this afternoon then. He dried the last dish. I'm going to be on my way now, Ernie. You let me know if you need to talk to me, all right? Ernie nodded, immediately picking up the dishes to put them away. I will. Thank you for coming, Pastor. You're welcome anytime. I might take you up on that. How much do you charge for individual meals? She shrugged. I usually charge a penny for lunch. Only a penny? His eyes lit up. You can expect me for lunch every day this week then. I'll bring my nickel when I come tomorrow. You need to get married, Pastor. A good wife would make you happy. He shook his head. I was married. She died in childbirth 10 years ago, and I can't bring myself to marry again. Mary was the love of my life. I'm sorry to hear it. Thank you. I still miss her every day. He headed for the front door, leaving Ernie staring after him. She wished she could ask her sister to send someone to marry the nice man, but he had to want to marry before she could do that. Elizabeth would never approve of someone requesting a bride for another person. She knew it had happened a few years back, and her sister had been angry. She finished putting the dishes away before she went to the parlor. She had mending that needed to be done while the house was quiet. She didn't clean rooms on Sundays, and all the men knew it. Chapter 8. An hour later, the pastor came back with a gray kitten. When Ernie took it from his hands, she buried her face in its fur. Is it a boy or a girl? That one's a girl. What will you name her? Ernie shrugged. I'll have to think about it. Thank you so much, Pastor. She carried the kitten to the backyard to introduce her to Roscoe. If she was going to have 2 pets, they needed to at least know one another. Roscoe was standing in the middle of the yard, still wearing her bonnet. You look so masculine with your bonnet on, Roscoe, Ernie said, shaking her head at the cantankerous goat. I brought you a new friend. She held the kitten out to the goat, who poked at the small ball of fur with his nose. Ernie set the kitten onto the back of his neck, and Roscoe stood still while the kitten got used to him. Then he slowly walked around the backyard, as if he was showing the kitten around. Ernie moved to sit down on the steps to watch them. It was a bit warmer, and the snow had melted, but she knew it was temporary. The door opened behind her, and Cliff dropped down onto the step beside her. She looked over at him. I'm sorry. Please don't stay angry with me. How could I stay angry? He sighed. I chopped enough wood for us to make it through the winter to get rid of my anger, but I'm better now. He looked at what she'd been watching. What's that lump on Roscoe's back? Ernie scooted toward her husband, and he slid his arm around her. That's our new kitten. The pastor's cat had kittens, and he thought we might like one. I thought I heard a mouse, and I love cats, so I accepted one. It's a little girl. What should we name her? Why is she riding around on Roscoe's back? She reminds me of the stories I've heard of the Queen of Sheba, being carried around everywhere she went. I brought her out here to meet the goat, and he nudged her with his nose, so I put her on his back. I think they like each other. She sighed happily. What should we name her? Sheba? She giggled. I actually like that. We'll call her Queen of Sheba. That's the perfect name for a cat that rides around on goats' backs. I wonder how long he's going to put up with her. I have no idea. What do I feed a kitten? She'd only had adult cats, or a mother cat to feed any kittens. Just give her a saucer of milk. When she needs more than that, she'll hunt for it herself. Cliff stroked his hand over the back of hers. I'm sorry the old ladies in town are jealous of you and making up stories. She frowned. You know, as long as you and the pastor and Katie know the stories are made up, they can say whatever they want. You three are the only ones who matter to me at all. He smiled at that, kissing her cheek. Well, I certainly know it's a bunch of lies. I think Katie does, too. Ernie nodded. She does. We talked about how the women of town make up stories if there aren't any good truths to gossip about. He grinned. Well, then I guess you're set. We know the pastor believes you. I was there when Mrs. Jenkins came over to tell him the lie. His eyes narrowed, and he told her she'd better not be making up lies like she had the last time. I like that he defends me so readily. He barely knows me. He doesn't have to know you to know that she's a troublemaker. You're working too hard for it to be possible that you even have time to cause the kind of problems she's talking about. Cliff stroked her arm, trying to keep her warm in the chill afternoon air. The pastor's going to start coming over for lunch every day. I told him it's a penny per meal, but I think I should charge him half, since he's the pastor. Cliff shrugged. Whatever you want. Do you really need another man to feed around here? I guess I do. At least I'll know he's fed properly. And don't forget, Katie is going to start working here tomorrow. Only 5 hours per day, and I think she'll eat lunch with us. It will help though, because I won't have to do everything myself. I'm glad she's going to be helping. I worry about all the work you do. You still look very tired to me. She nodded. I am tired. I think I'm going to make a pork roast for supper. I'm going to go put it in the oven, and then take a nap if you don't mind. He frowned at her. A nap? You never take naps. I do when I'm tired. We've only been married for a month. That's hardly enough time for you to think you know everything about me. So when we've been married for 50 years, then I can tell you I know everything about you. She grinned. Do you think we'll be married for 50 years? I sure hope so. I can't imagine life without you in it. He watched her as she blushed and disappeared into the house. He was still a little angry at the women who were gossiping about her, but she'd obviously decided to let it go. If she could, then he could too. He had half a mind to go and talk to their husbands about keeping their wives in hand, though. Obviously, they had a lot more free time than his wife did, because they had time to make up ridiculous lies about others. Ernie kept too busy for that kind of nonsense. Asterisk. The pastor showed up for breakfast the next morning, bringing a whole dime. I want to be here for breakfast and lunch, I decided. I usually have someone bring me supper, but I need 2 good meals a day. I talked to Cliff, and we're charging you half for your meals. You're the pastor after all. I'm going to go and get you your change. Ernie hurried from the room before he could protest. She wanted him to be there, and she was going to see to it that he knew he was welcome. After breakfast, she started a pot of soup on the stove for lunch while she mixed the dough for bread. She couldn't believe how many loaves of bread the men could go through in just one day, and with the pastor added into the mix, she was going to have to do even more baking. By the time Katie arrived, Ernie had the bread in the oven and the kitchen cleaned from breakfast. The house was filled with the smell of bread baking. Katie followed her nose to the kitchen. "How are you feeling this morning?" Ernie shrugged. "I'm still tired, but other than that I'm doing fine. I've done the baking for the day, and I have soup on for lunch. Are you eating with us?" Katie nodded. "If that's all right. You can take the cost of my lunch out of my pay." "Of course not. You're helping me." Ernie sighed. "Would you mind cleaning the men's rooms this morning? I need to mop the kitchen floor and dust the parlor." "I'd be happy to. Why don't you keep Abigail with you?" Ernie nodded, reaching her hands out for the baby. An hour later, Katie met her downstairs, her share of the chores finished. "Now what?" Ernie looked around. "Would you mind cleaning the bathrooms? I want to bake a cake for dessert this evening." "Happy to do it. How's my little princess?" "She's content to just watch me from her basket. She's such a good baby." My younger siblings would all scream uproariously if they were expected to lie still for more than 15 minutes at a time. She is a good baby. Her teeth are doing much better too. Have you been using my mother's whiskey trick? Katie looked embarrassed for a moment, and she nodded reluctantly. I told Ethan you'd suggested it, and he went out and got some whiskey from the saloon. He said he was tired of me dancing attendance on her all night long. I'm glad she's doing better, even if you did it against your better judgment. Me too. Katie smiled at the baby, who was drooling happily. I'll be back when the bathrooms are cleaned. After lunch, Katie helped to do the dishes and to peel the mountain of potatoes needed for supper at the boarding house before she left. Thank you so much, Ernie told her as she was leaving. I'm happy to be here with my friend, Katie responded. I'll be back tomorrow. When Cliff came in, he looked around the house. It looks like you and Katie worked hard today. We did. I'm glad she agreed to do it. So am I. I know you need it. He studied her face. You still look very tired to me. I think you need to start going to bed earlier. Ernie wasn't about to argue with him. Another hour or two of sleep sounded downright glorious. I'll take you up on that. Asterisk. When another week had passed without her courses coming, Ernie knew it was time to go see Mrs. Sims. Leaving Katie in charge of cooking for her army of men, Ernie followed the simple instructions she was given on how to get to Mrs. Sims's house. She knocked on the door and waited, hoping to find the older woman in a better mood than she'd been in the times Ernie had seen her at church. When the door opened, she knew luck was not with her that day. The woman looked angrier than she'd seen her before. What can I do for you? Ernie bit her lip, not sure how to approach her. I think I might be expecting. I figured as much when Katie went out of her way to introduce you to me. Mrs. Sims opened the door wide. Well, come in and tell me what your symptoms are. They talked for a few minutes, and Mrs. Sims had her lie back so she could examine her. I'd say you're going to have your baby around the end of June, Mrs. Sims finally told her. Have you been around pregnant women much? Ernie nodded. I have 8 younger siblings, and 4 of my sisters are popping out babies like there's no tomorrow. I'm not experiencing the morning sickness like they did, though. It's odd, but I feel fine except for the exhaustion. Mrs. Sims shrugged. Some women vomit, and some don't. From what I've seen, you have a better chance of losing the baby if you're not sick all the time, so be careful. Don't lift anything very heavy, and you'll need to calm down your nighttime activities. You mean I shouldn't make love with my husband? Ernie asked, blushing a bit at speaking so frankly. Of course, the older woman knew where babies came from, and since she was pregnant, it was obvious that she had made love at least once. You can keep taking care of your husband's needs, but I think you should stay away from those other men staying with you. Ernie blinked at her a couple of times. I wish you wouldn't believe rumors. She turned and walked away, wondering if there was another midwife around she could see. She had no desire to keep seeing Mrs. Sims, who immediately believed the worst of her and didn't have a smile for anyone, from what she could see. She walked to the house, wondering how long she should wait before telling Cliff about the baby. She knew that he wouldn't let her work if she was pregnant, but she also knew they needed her income for the time being. With Katie's help, she was sure she could manage for several months yet. When she got back to the house, she asked Katie about the possibility of another midwife in town. Katie shook her head. I don't know of anyone else. I think you'd have to go to the next town over, and that would be a long ride in a wagon, or you'd have to take the train. You're better off sticking with Mrs. Sims. Ernie sighed. I was afraid of that. She sat down on the sofa, immediately reaching for Abigail. Do you know she was mean enough to mention the foul rumors going around about me? The ones about me entertaining all the men that stay here? Oh, that's just wrong. Those rumors are nasty, and obviously untrue. Anyone can see that you and Cliff have a special connection. People like that, they make me want to spit. I know, I'll hold her while you snatch her bald-headed. Ernie laughed. I'm really used to having people talk about me, but I've never experienced anyone making up such mean lies. I don't know why they do it. The pastor stepped into the house then, and spotted the 2 women sitting on the sofa. Am I early? He asked. Ernie got to her feet. Of course not. I'll have lunch on the table in 5 minutes. She hurried into the kitchen to serve the potato and ham casserole she and Katie had prepared that morning before she'd left to talk to Mrs. Sims. She cut 2 full loaves of bread into slices and set them in the middle of the table, then put some butter out. She quickly set the table, and the men all came in at once, laughing and joking with one another. As she watched them, Ernie couldn't believe how many people believed the foul rumors. She'd come to town worried that people would discover she'd been called names for her childhood indiscretions. Now here she was, an adult who was only working hard, and she was being called much more vicious names for things she hadn't even done. She hoped that the rumors would end soon, because she was going to have a talk with some of the women otherwise. It wasn't something she was keen on doing, because she wasn't sure she could make it through the talk without slapping at least one of the women for the lies they'd spread. Then what would people think of her? Chapter 9. 2 weeks later, Ernie still hadn't told Cliff about the baby. She wanted to tell him, but she didn't want to have to shut down the boarding house. They needed the extra income, and the truth was, she enjoyed running it, though it was difficult with her fatigue. On Wednesday afternoon, she and Katie were taking a break after bringing in the last of the laundry and putting it away. Have you told Cliff about the baby yet? Katie asked. Ernie shook her head. I know he's going to know soon, and I want him to know, but I'm not ready to stop working. Katie shook her head. Ethan would be furious with me if I kept something so important from him for any length of time. When will you tell him? I don't know yet. Soon, I'm sure. She looked down at her slender stomach, glad that she wasn't showing yet. She didn't need a thickening of her middle to tell him what was going on before she did. Ernie, you have to do it soon. I really think you're making a mistake by not telling him. I'm sure I am. Ernie sighed. But if I tell him now, I already have to say that I've known for 2 weeks. He's going to be angry regardless. Why not put it off for a little longer? She looked up as she heard a throat clear, and her heart skipped a beat. Cliff was standing there at the doorway to the parlor, listening to everything she and Katie said. Katie followed her friend's line of vision and jumped to her feet. I think that's my cue to take my baby and go home. Ernie got to her feet, ignoring her friend as she faced her husband. She folded her hands together, trying her best not to fidget nervously. You're home, she said with a bright smile. Cliff nodded, taking her hand and pulling her toward their bedroom. They wouldn't be disturbed there, and they obviously needed to have a nice long talk. Why didn't you tell me? You've known you were pregnant for 2 weeks, and you never said a word? I've suspected for 3, Ernie said quietly. She'd never been good at lies or subterfuge, but she was great at confessions. Most people found it better if she confessed to her wrongdoing of her own accord. Are you sure? Ernie nodded. I went and saw the midwife here in town. She's not a very pleasant person, and she believes the lies about me. I think I want to try to find another midwife. Can we do that? Cliff blinked at the change of subject. Oh, no you don't. We're talking about the fact that you hid your pregnancy from me before we move on to talking about anything else. Whether it's another midwife or getting another cat. You should have seen Sheba and Roscoe today. She waits on the back steps for him, and he goes over and stands there patiently while she jumps on his back. I don't think that kitten's paws have ever touched the ground. She's absolutely rotten. Ernie. Why didn't you just tell me as soon as you knew? Ernie sighed. Her tactics were obviously not working, and it was time for her to face the music. Well, I didn't know how you'd react. You already told me we really need the extra money, so I thought it would be best if I just waited a little longer and saved as much money as I could. Katie has been making sure that I don't do any heavy lifting or anything that could harm the baby. You know I don't want you working so much now that you're pregnant. I do, and I even understand why. But I wanted to make your life easier. You told me to wait 6 months to get pregnant, and while I knew you would have to know before then, I thought the longer that I worked the better it would be for you. So I waited. She looked down at her hands for a moment, ashamed of not telling him, but still certain she'd make the same decision again. I'm sorry. Are you really? Cliff shook his head at her. She had to be the most stubborn, headstrong woman in all of Montana. No wonder she and the goat got along so well. She nodded. I am. I needed to help you out as much as I could by continuing to work. I did help you out, didn't I? He sighed. You're going to need to stop working now. She frowned, looking down. I can understand not being able to keep up the pace I'm going at now, but how about if I just cooked? And people let us know when they'd be joining us for a meal? Like the pastor does. The pastor now ate 3 meals per day at the boarding house, along with all the other men. I could make 3 meals a day without a problem, as long as I wasn't doing as much cleaning and laundry. I think that would be fine, don't you? Do you make enough from cooking to make it worthwhile? She nodded emphatically. I could do really well just acting like our kitchen table was a restaurant. I wouldn't make as much as I do, but I'd be able to contribute enough that I wouldn't feel guilty every time I wanted to buy yarn to knit a pair of booties for the baby. Or so I could buy fabric to make you a Christmas present. He thought about it for a moment. I suppose that would be all right. And then if you didn't feel like you were getting enough rest, you could cut down to 1 or 2 meals a week. Or 1 or 2 per day. She couldn't imagine eating with just him. She didn't think they'd ever had a private meal. I think that's fair. But where will the men go? It's almost winter. There's snow on the ground. They'll find places to stay. I'm not nearly as worried about them as I am about you. He smiled for the first time since he'd heard the news. And I'm worried about my baby. My son or my daughter. I would teach a son how to make saddles, and you could teach our little girl to cook just like you. I hope she has the same hand in the kitchen. It would be so easy to marry off a girl with your cooking talents. Ernie put her hands on her hips. You are not going to marry off my unborn daughter, Clifford Solomon. I'm going to keep her small forever, and we're going to buy her dolls and let her be best friends with little Abigail next door. We're talking like we know the baby will be a girl. I'd be just as happy with a little boy. He put his hands on her shoulders and drew her to him, his lips brushing against hers. I'm so happy you're having a baby. Ernie smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. I am too. I can't wait. I'll tell the men at supper that they need to find new places to live by Friday of next week. That gives them a week and a half. Should be plenty of time to figure something out. All right. Make sure you let them know we'll still be serving 3 meals per day. They just need to let me know when they'll be here, and a place will be set for them. Will you open up to others in town? She shrugged. We always eat in the kitchen, but we have a dining room as well. I could conceivably handle twice as many men for meals. Do you want to do that? He shook his head at her. You're a lot more business-minded than I'd realized. I might be willing to agree to that if you could take Katie on as a permanent partner. I'll talk to her about it tomorrow. She frowned after a moment. I don't want it to get out about me having a baby yet. There are so many foul rumors about me. I hate it, but I don't want any erroneous conclusions drawn about our baby before she's even born. There you go saying she again. Well, she's either going to be best friends with little Abigail, or he's going to marry her. No choice in the matter. Cliff grinned. I like the way you think. He didn't mention what the people were saying, but he didn't forget about it either. He had a little plan in mind, and if he thought on it long enough, he'd find a way to make it work. She needed to live in a place where she was accepted and loved for the sweet, kind woman she was. No one needed to look down on her. Asterisk. Katie came over more than an hour early the next day. What happened after I left? She asked, setting the baby's basket onto the floor and picking up a towel to dry the dishes Ernie was washing. Oh, he wasn't happy with me for hiding it from him, but he understood my reasoning. We're going to compromise. I'm going to keep cooking for others, but we're shutting down the boarding house. I'll serve 3 meals a day to whomever wants to eat here, but they need to let me know in advance. Ernie gave her friend a questioning look. If you're willing to become my partner in this, we'll open up both the kitchen and the dining room, and we'll be able to serve twice as many customers. Partner? Ernie nodded. We'd split the profits down the middle after paying for food. You'd help with cooking and cleanup, of course. Well, yes, of course. I wonder what Ethan would say if I was helping to serve 3 meals per day over here. Talk to him and let me know. I'm willing to do it without you, because my husband still needs me to make some extra money for us, but I'd rather do it with you. Many hands make light work, after all. I'll talk to him. Maybe if I promise him that I'll bring him home food every night he'd agree. He sure likes your cooking better than mine. Katie wiped off another plate and set it on the stack she'd made. Part of the deal would be that I'll teach you to cook. That'll get his attention. Katie grinned. It would get his attention for sure. I want to do it. Don't make any big decisions without me. I won't. Asterisk. the men started moving out over the weekend. Some of them had claims outside of town, but they'd moved in because of the better food. "You're still going to let us come for all meals, right?" Andrew asked as he carried his belongings down the stairs in a wooden crate. "I'm going to miss your cooking something fierce. You let me know what meals you'll be here for, and I'll be cooking for you." "Every one of them," he said, a grin on his face. Ernie laughed. For now, that answer pleased her. In a few months, when it was hard to tie her apron strings, that would be a little more difficult. "I'll make a note of that. I wish you would still take in laundry, but I think that's one of the reasons you're kicking us all out. Too much housework, and too much laundry." Ernie nodded. "Cliff wants me to take it easier now that the baby's on its way." "I can understand that. I'm sure going to miss living here, Mrs. Solomon." Ernie stood on tiptoe and kissed Andrew's cheek. "And you'll be missed around here. No doubt about it." Cliff chose that moment to walk into the hall, and he frowned for just a moment before he moved on. He didn't like seeing her kiss another man, even on the cheek, but he knew his wife would never betray him. She was too honest for that. At bedtime on Saturday, they were down to only one extra man, and that was Jake. "I could handle it if Jake wanted to stay here indefinitely," she said softly to Cliff. "You can decide, but I really wouldn't mind." Cliff shook his head. "No, he's moving in with Andrew, and he's going to help with some of the chores in exchange for his room. He'll pay for meals here, and I think they'll both bring milk and eggs in on occasion to help pay for their meals, but they're not going to live here. We're cutting down the amount of work you have. You can't keep going as you have been." Ernie nodded, knowing he was right. Her eyes had dark circles on them, and she looked thinner than she had when she'd first arrived. She still had no morning sickness, but she was working too hard for the condition she was in, and she knew it as well as everyone else did. "All right. Now you go on to bed. I'll be in shortly." Ernie pressed a kiss to his cheek and wandered off to wash her face before going to sleep. She was so tired. It would be good to be down to only cooking for others and not doing their wash and cleaning up after them. She knew the move was a good one, but she still felt a bit guilty about making the men move out. She knew it was for the best, though, and her son or daughter would be healthier for it. She climbed under the covers and immediately closed her eyes. Church started bright and early, and word was out about the baby. She could only imagine what people would be saying about her character now. Would anyone even believe the baby was Cliff's? It bothered her that her name had been maligned so much since coming to town, but it would be even worse if Cliff's and the baby's names were added to the gossip. None of them had done anything to deserve that sort of treatment. If only there was a way to silence the old biddies who couldn't find anything else to gossip about. Ernie closed her eyes, trying not to think about them, and instead concentrating on the life growing inside her. Soon there would be a baby in her arms, and she couldn't wait. In the long run, family and love was what mattered, not gossipy old women with nothing better to do than make up stories about others and spread them around town. Chapter 10. Ernie walked into church the following morning with her head held high. She knew people were going to be talking about her, but she refused to care. She'd been talked about her entire life, after all. Sure enough, Mrs. Jenkins was whispering behind her hand as Ernie passed her. She continued on, clinging to Cliff's arm, but then she stopped short. Turning, she walked over to Mrs. Jenkins, her eyes meeting those of the older woman, who looked more than a little shocked. Ernie had finally had enough. She wasn't going to put up with the gossip any longer. She had as a child, because she'd deserved it. Now, though, she'd done nothing but work hard since she came to town. "Mrs. Jenkins," she said, her voice loud and calm, "I would like it a great deal if you would stop making up lies about me. I came to town to marry Bert, but he died before I arrived. Somehow, you've made that my fault." Instead of turning tail and running back to Massachusetts, I used my skills and started a business, which has been very successful, I might add. As soon as I had guests in my boarding house, you accused me of having relations with one of those men. It was untrue, but to stop the gossip, we married. I'm glad we did, because I love my husband very much, but still you talked about me. Ernie took a step closer to the older woman, noting the panicked look on her face. Then you started saying I was doing things that I can't imagine how I'd have the energy for, but you accused me of them. Never to my face, of course. No, it's your way to talk behind women's backs and make them out to be monsters when they can't defend themselves. Mrs. Jenkins turned red, and she sputtered, "Well, I never." "Oh yes you did, and that's the whole problem. Now, I'm carrying my husband's baby, and I see you gossiping again. I'm sure you're saying that there's no way to know who the real father of my child is, aren't you? Your lies are as predictable as they are vile. You don't know anything about me. You don't know that I was raised on a farm back in Massachusetts. You don't know that I can ride a horse bareback, but I've never ridden using a saddle. You don't know that I cook better than most women around." Ernie took a deep breath. "And you don't know that the entire population of Beckham, Massachusetts, refers to my siblings and me as the demon horde. When I first came to town, I shuddered that anyone would hear what we'd been known as, but do you know something?" Mrs. Jenkins shook her head slowly. "No. I'm not ashamed of being in the demon horde. I'm going to tell you why. As a member of the demon horde, I'm not afraid to touch snakes or other reptiles. I'm not afraid to tie a woman into her own outhouse and tip the building over. And I know how to shoot a gun better than just about any man you put in front of me. You keep talking about me like you have been, Mrs. Jenkins, and you'll need to start watching over your shoulder, because I'm sneaky, and I'm strong. You won't know what hit you when I decide to get my revenge." "Are you threatening me?" Mrs. Jenkins' face was so red it was almost purple. "Yes, I am. I don't lie, I don't cheat, but I do get revenge. I'm warning you right now. You will stop talking about me or any person that I love. If it gets back to me again that you're saying anything about me or who fathered my baby, you will feel my wrath. I don't care how long you've been part of this town or how important you think you are to it. If I have to, I will bring every sibling I have here, and will slowly turn your life into a living hell." Ernie smiled sweetly at the older woman. "Have I made myself clear? Or do you need me to draw you a diagram?" "I believe you." Mrs. Jenkins's voice was little more than a whisper. "I'll stop talking about you. You'll stop talking about everyone. All the people in this town are now my loved ones, because they embraced me and made me one of their own. All but you and your band of harridans. So you will stop spreading lies about everyone, or I will be your worst nightmare." Ernie stepped back and smiled at Cliff, who was watching her with a grin. "Is my hat on straight?" Her hands went to her hat and she adjusted it just a bit. Cliff laughed out loud. "Your hat is just as perfect as you are." He caught her hand and pulled her to him, kissing her right there in the middle of the church. When he'd finished, he turned to Mr. Jenkins, who had come to defend his wife. "I just want you to know that my wife meant every word she said. I also want you to know that I will make good on everything she said if she's unable to. She's carrying my baby, you see. There will be no more ugly talk about her or anyone else in this town. Good day." He calmly tucked Ernie's hand through the curve of his arm and led her to a pew across the church from the older couple. "Have I told you how utterly perfect you just were?" Ernie grinned. "No, you haven't. I didn't embarrass you?" "Embarrass me? I couldn't be prouder. You are the most magnificent woman alive, and I thank God every day you were the one who opened the door at that boarding house. Maybe I should go back and thank Mrs. Jenkins, now that I think about it." He looked over toward the other woman, and realized then that the low buzz of voices was louder in volume than usual. Those who hadn't witnessed his wife's threats to Mrs. Jenkins were hearing about them now. No one would dare mess with her again. Thank her? For what? Making me out to be a trollop? Ernie was sure her husband had lost his mind. You've been working much too hard lately, dear. You're an expectant father after all. Yes, I am, but I wouldn't be if Mrs. Jenkins hadn't forced us to marry so quickly. I'd have taken at least a month to propose, but she didn't let me take more than 24 hours. I really should thank her. Ernie giggled as the pastor walked to the front of the church, calling them to quiet. Before I tell you what our first hymn will be, I want to say that there will be no more gossip in this church at all. A lovely young lady has been the victim of too many of the older women here, and it will no longer be tolerated. If you feel the need to gossip, I will feel the need to tell you that you are no longer welcome in my church. No one deserves to be put through the ordeal Ernestine Solomon has gone through in her short time here in Prairie Dog. So consider yourselves warned. Gossip in this town is a thing of the past. He picked up his hymnal and flipped through it, nodding to the organ player. Let's start with hymn number 24. Ernie felt many eyes on her, but she kept her gaze on the hymnal in front of her, and she sang robustly, though she was off-key throughout the entire song. She didn't care. No one dared speak badly about her now. Not after the way both Cliff and the pastor had defended her. She breathed a sigh of relief as she sat down. No, people wouldn't be gossiping about her any longer. Half the town would be afraid to even speak her name for a while, and that was just how she liked it. As soon as they got home, Ernie fixed lunch for the ravenous men who joined them. She was surprised to see Katie and Ethan there. Ethan watched as she worked, and he bit into the pot roast she'd made with a smile. Katie tells me you want her to be your business partner. Ernie nodded. She didn't really think a lot of Ethan, but he made her friend happy, so he must not be all bad. I do. She's been invaluable to me as she's worked beside me to make the boarding house the best it could be. Now that I'll just be making 3 meals a day, I think I would still like her support and help. Ethan nodded at his wife. I'd be fine with you working with her as her partner. I think you have a lot to learn. Katie smiled at her friend, nodding. I'll be here in the morning, then. I can handle breakfast myself. In fact, if you could stay until supper time, I will do the supper dishes myself, but I'll leave the breakfast dishes for you. You can take home meals for your family. Sounds good. After the meal, Katie jumped up and helped with the dishes, leaving her daughter with Ethan. I can't believe you talked him into it, Katie whispered softly. I think he was already convinced when he got here. Ernie washed while Katie wiped the dishes. They made a good team. After the house was empty between the lunch and supper rushes, Cliff pulled Ernie into the parlor. There's something I want to ask you about. She sat down on the sofa with him, turning her full attention to him. What did you want to ask? Well, when you were talking to Mrs. Jenkins. That old harridan. Ernie shook her head, still annoyed with how things had to play out to get the woman to stop her bad behavior. You told her you were glad we'd had to marry, because you love me. His blue eyes met her green, and he looked vulnerable for the first time since she'd met him. Did you mean that? Ernie understood then. He may never return her feelings, but he needed to know if they were real. She reached out and grasped his hand in hers, holding it tightly. I did mean that, with all my heart. I love you so much, Cliff. I can't imagine what my life would be like today if I'd married the man I came here to marry. Cliff pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, which had mostly fallen from the perfect knot she'd worn it in for church. I love you, too. So much. I worried that I was the only one with these feelings. I think I fell in love with you the moment you told me I couldn't go up to my room until I'd had a bath. You liked my bossiness? I liked your spunk. I liked your ability to tell me exactly what you needed, and made it work for both of us. You really didn't mind? Ernie had been shocked that he wanted to court her after she'd told him what to do in no uncertain terms. He shrugged. I didn't. I thought you were pretty spectacular even then. Although, I must say, the way you told Mrs. Jenkins what you thought of her at church today sent me reeling. I had no idea you intended to do that. I didn't. It just kind of happened. A knock at the door had Cliff hurrying to open it. He was trying to make sure Ernie sat as much as possible. Opening the door wide, he found Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins on the other side, and Mr. Jenkins had his cowboy hat off and held across his chest. May we come in? He asked. Cliff stepped out of the way while the couple came in, and he invited them into the parlor. How can we help you? He wasn't going to offer them anything to eat or drink. Not with the way they'd treated his wife. Mr. Jenkins nudged his wife with his elbow. Deborah has something to say to you. Mrs. Jenkins looked reluctant, but she spoke. I'm very sorry for the lies I told about you. As a Christian woman, I know that what I did was very wrong, and I want to ask your forgiveness. Ernie wanted to tell her to get out of her house, and yell that she'd never forgive her, but she was a Christian woman also, and she knew she couldn't do that. I forgive you. And she would work very hard to forget what all had been said, but she wasn't sure it was possible. Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice a mere whisper. Ernie couldn't help but wonder why the woman was the way she was. She wasn't sure she'd ever know. After the older couple had left, Cliff sat down beside Ernie once again. I'm glad you stood up for yourself and all of her victims. It was time someone did. I'm just thankful you and the pastor were so adamant in your defense of me. It was heartwarming. He smiled, cupping her cheek with one of his hands, making her feel protected. I love you so much it hurts. Thank you for being my wife. She smiled. I can't imagine anything in this world I'd rather be. Epilogue. Ernie stared down at the baby girl in her arms. She still couldn't quite believe that she was finally here. Mrs. Sims smiled down at her. She looks like her mother. Ernie sniffled as a tear drifted down her face. She felt so weepy as she looked at the little face, and realized that the midwife was right, the infant looked just like her. The blonde hair could be either her or Cliff, but the shape of her nose and the high cheekbones were definitely her. Thank you for helping me. Thank you for making our town a better place to live in, and not only with your cooking. Ernie had found out months before that Mrs. Sims had been a favorite victim of the gossips in town before Ernie had arrived. Her confrontation with Mrs. Jenkins had helped more people than she'd imagined it would. I'm just glad I was able to help the situation. Mrs. Sims walked to the door. I'm going to let your husband in now. He actually thought I should allow him in the room while you were laboring. Do you believe that? Ernie smiled. She would have liked to have had his support through the long hours of pain, but she knew it wasn't done. He does have his own ideas about things, doesn't he? I'll leave you two alone. I'll be by in the morning to check on you, but if you need me before then, send your man for me. Thank you. Ernie looked up as Cliff hurried into the room, sitting carefully beside her on the bed. Is it a boy or a girl? Mrs. Sims wouldn't tell me when I asked. We have a daughter. Cliff felt as if the world was closing in on him. What would he do when men wanted to court her? What are you going to call her? How would you feel about Bertha? I think we should call her Bertie, because without Bert, we'd never have found each other. I love that idea. Bertie. He touched his daughter's hand and was thrilled when she curled her little fingers around his. I can't believe we have a daughter. I can't believe how happy I am. Make sure you put a sign in the window that we're closed for a couple of days. I'm not going to feel up to fetching meals for half the men in town this week. Katie could do it, but I agree. You need time alone with our daughter. Isn't she the most beautiful thing you've ever seen? Ernie asked, staring into the little face. Yes, she is. Cliff wasn't looking at his daughter though. He was looking at the amazing wife beside him. The woman who had changed his entire world.